Let's continue our topic about philosophy perspectives about the self. So let's have how to identify the self in the modern philosophy. Okay, so remember that our last philosopher is Saint Augustine, and his era or period is about the Dark Ages or the medieval period. So for the modern philosophers, here comes the Renaissance period or the rebirth of learning. So dumami po yung mga philosophers dahil nagkaroon ng stagnant nung Dark Ages. So the focus is on man again. Why on man again? Remember on our past philosophers, they focused that the self is located on the soul. But for modern philosophers, the self is identified as the man itself. So the dignity and worth of man with regard to the power of his reason to know the truth of his nature. So we have here the word reason, rationalization, thinking. So how does the man will know his nature? By collecting information about himself, by knowing what is all about himself, by reasoning out why my behaviors are like this. So here it is, our first modern philosopher. He is known as the father of modern philosophy. He is also a French rationalist, and he believes about the dualistic separation of mind and body. His name is Rene Descartes. So he recognizes the significant questions about the human existence of the early philosophers. That's why he also believes in dualism, but he separates the mind and the body. So he discusses knowledge of human existence through rational inquiry and real-world experimentation. So Rene Descartes is more on the thinking ability of the person in the real-world phenomenon or in the real-world experience. So what is a substance? So a substance is the self, and it refers to anything that exists in itself. So he called the self as a substance. This is the self. This is what is existing in the self, which is the man. So he had two substances. We have the infinite and the finite. So infinite is the abstract substance, refers to the innate idea of God. So he referred the substance, which is the man, into the ability of rationalizing or thinking. So we have the infinite, this is God's rationalization because it's an ending, it's infinity. We don't know what God thinks. We don't know what's God's plan. And we have ours, which is called the finite. This is our idea, which is only limited to what we know or to what others know. What is this term? This term is called Cartesian dualism. So dualism means the separation of the mind and the body. So we have independent variables. So when we say independent variables, this depends on the man. So the body and mind depends on the man. So if your body is thin, that depends upon how you treat yourself. If your mind is sleepy or cloudy, that depends on how you exercise your critical thinking skills. So the body is independent of the soul, since the mind is not the body's provider of life. Correct? The body sustains itself through the soul, not the mind. So for example, no, yung isang pasyente is na coma, brain, wala siyang May brain activity siya pero na-coma siya. It says there na yung soul niya is nasa katawan niya pa. 'Di ba? Pag na-comatose ka, right? They think na wala yung soul mo sa body mo since meron ka pa ring brain activity. The mind is non-material, immortal, conscious being, independent of the physical laws of the universe. So what are these physical laws of the universe? Ito po yung konsensya natin. Kahit wala siyang detailed rules, minsan kinakain tayo ng conscience natin not to do this and not to do that because that's the way we think. Diba? Like for example, wala naman pong nagsasabi na pwedeng, ano ba, for example, physical laws of the universe is put on some makeup, di ba? Example doon is, hindi naman mandatory na mag-wear ng makeup, pero sometimes you have this conscience na, dapat I should look presentable in front of other people. So, that is how your mind works in terms of physical laws of the universe. This is his phrase, Rene Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Kung ano yung iniisip ko, ako yun. So, the self is just a mental and thinking substance. So, tayo rin lang ang nag-iisip kung ano tayo. Like on this picture, I overthink, therefore, I am anxious, di ba? I overthink of my requirements and my deadlines. That's why I'm stressed. I overthink na crush ako ng crush ko. Kaya, nai-inlove ako at napapaasa ako. So, I think, therefore, I am.
The next philosopher is John Locke. So, who is John Locke? He believed that the source of knowledge of reality must pass the test of sensory experience. So, what are these sensory experience? So, we will boil down to our five senses. We have the sense of sight, sense of hearing, touch, smell, and then taste. So he opposed the idea that the reason is the only way of looking at the self. So you will understand yourself not just by reason, but also through the senses. For him, the self is comparable to an empty space, and such empty space will be provided with sense data through our experiences in the real world. So imagine an empty cup. So wala siyang laman. So through your experiences, through your senses, napupuno yung cup na yon unti-unti. Okay, may nakita ko maganda, yung picture maganda. Okay, that is one experience. I smell the food. Ang bango ng lechon. One experience. And so on and so forth. So you will realize your wants. Ano yung gusto ko? Ano yung mga characteristics na gusto kong makita? Ano yung mga gusto kong sensations? So dun mo makikita kung ano ka. Kung what is yourself all about? What is yourself wants? The process of reflection and analysis undergone by this sense will lead to sense perception. So what we see is what we understand. What we smell is what we like. What we taste it is what we want to eat. And so on and so forth. So that is John Locke for us, for the principle of understanding the self. Okay, for him, just like what I've said, the self is like an empty space or a term called tabula rasa, a blank slate sheet of paper at birth upon which life experiences are written. Imagine a white cartolina, sobrang linis. Pero once na may mga sulat na siya, di ba? So, may mga experiences ka na rin in life. So the existence of self is reliant on our consciousness of it. So if we are conscious enough to be to look at the details of the world, then that is how we perceive ourselves. Like for example, imagine a painting, right? So sa iba, nakikita nila is, ay maganda yung picture. Okay, colorful yung picture. But through your deepest conscience of mind, you can see the detail part of the picture. Mga wavy lines, mga yung tone ng colors, yung abstract ng painting, ng meaning ng painting, and so on and so forth. So this is the term personal identity wherein every aspect of our physical body is integrated to our personal self. So it means that what is in your body will basically boils down to your physical self. Like for example, if one leg has to be amputated, puputulin because of an accident, a person's personal identity remains the same in spite of iisa na lang yung leg niya. Therefore, this personal identity, distinct from whatever body it finds itself, is associated with. So yun nga, even though you have different defects in your physical body, your consciousness on how you understand yourself, your personal self, will still be the same. Just like a cup pa din yan, kahit anong mangyari. Pero yung tubig doon is water pa din. So we can identify ourselves through an empty cup with a water kahit iba yung cup na ginagamit. Next philosopher is we have David Hume. So he is, for him, self is intelligible, meaning, and must be based on sense impressions. So what is this sense of impressions? Ito ba yung mga first impressions natin sa tao? Like, okay, I see my crush. Crush on siya agad. Oh, I see a cute puppy. He is so cute. It's so cute. So, it is that basically what we identify through ourself, through others' self, through their first impression nga ba? Let's find out. So Hume argued that inductive reasoning and belief is casualty cannot be justified rationally. Instead, they result from custom and mental habit. So you identified yourself through the customs and traditions in where or in which roots you belong to. So kung taga Pangasinan ka, you can identify yourself through that tradition. If taga Baguio ka, you can identify yourself through that customs. And when we say mental habit, it is the distinction of you can predict what will happen next. Okay? Just like when you identify yourself as, okay, kaharap ko yung module, aantukin na naman ako. Yun agad kasi yung naisip nating pattern if we are facing our new modules ahead. May quiz, tatama rin na naman ako. So that is our mental habit. We have to change that so that we can attract positive energy through our modules. So we never actually perceive that one event causes another, but only experience the constant conjunction of events. So we have perceived, di ba, yung cause and effect of one another, but it is not truly what will happen. We just tried to connect the dots, kumbaga. Okay? Then he positioned that knowledge can only be possible if it is sensed and experienced. So for David Locke, for John Locke, it's about sensory experiences, right? So, it smells good. It's beautiful in my eyes. So for David Hume, you must experience that taste good. You must experience that beautiful sight. Okay? So our ideas regarding the self is based on impressions that are temporary. Parang first impression. All first impressions are temporary. Kasi basically, if you widen your knowledge through that person, that first impression will eventually lay down. Okay, so for him, there is no persisting self. It changes throughout our experiences. So here we have concepts and faculties. So what are these? So impressions are the experience of sense, such as pain, pleasure, heat, cold, etc., which are lively and vivid. So imagine a hot pot, a boiling pot of water. Okay, mainit to, sabi mo, no? Kasi kumukulo. Then you suddenly touch it. So you have the impression of pain, right? Just like a person. Ang maldita to. Yun yung first impression mo. Then, you experience going out with her. Hindi naman pala friendly lang. Okay, so there. The next is we have, so impressions, the next is ideas. It refers to the recalled copies of the impressions. So, example, yung girl, maldita to. Okay? And then you experience going out with her. Friendly siya. Right? So, the ideas there is nagiging collection na siya. We have maldita, friendly, and what comes next? Okay? So there. Next is we have memory. This is where we store our impressions with exactness. So the memory of going out with her is I want to keep yung pagiging friendly vibe niya. So that will be the memory of her, right? The next is imaginations, makes it possible for us to formulate, order, and arrange ideas. So, nag-go out ka with her. So, she is friendly. So, your imagination will start growing. I want to be friends with her. Siguro next time, we will hang out in the park. Laro kami ng volleyball, ng badminton, so that I can get to know her. Okay, so there. So the self is nothing but a collection of different perceptions that flourish with rapidity and are in permanent flux and movement. So it varies from different situations and environment. We just have to collect the idea of what we are, of what are the impressions of ourselves towards the other person. Okay, so there you go. Next philosopher is we have. So before we move forward to our next philosopher, you can see there a word association with an asterisk. So what does this word in connection with David Hume's perception about the self? So association or the principle of association is the process of formulating, ordering, and formulating ideas. So we try to associate ourselves to other women, to other gentlemen, to other boys and girls, to other students, and to other majors as well. So example, we tend to associate our ideas with one another when there are resemblance in them. So like for example, I am an ABM student, therefore I should take BSBA and I associate myself to other ABM student as well who took up or who are now taking BSBA as a course. Another could be men from different countries look alike. Right? Koreans, BTS. So kung di mo sila kilala isa-isa, magkakamukha sila para sa'yo. Then men who are tall are associated exactly. Basketball player yan. Women who are great dancers are associated with TikTokerist yan, magaling sumayaw. So therefore, according to Hume, we try to associate ourselves towards the other group or towards the other people by collecting ideas and impressions about them towards us. Our next philosopher combined sensory component from John Locke and David Hume, and also the rational component of Descartes. So his name is Immanuel Kant. So human knowledge or human self is composed of sensory component and rational component because knowledge is indeed a sensory element. Okay, so what we sense is actually what we will conceptualize in terms of our thinking of thoughts. So what we sense about ourselves is what we think about ourselves. So we have here a word a priori, which means the rational component of the mind. So it is coming from the mind and is independent with the sensation. So when we say independent, it comes from with or without sensation because it doesn't depend on the sensation. He also believed that we are not an empty space. We are not an empty cabinet or a tabula rasa, which John Locke termed, because we have a built-in structure in mind which we use to organize those collective sensations or principles, and it will be sorted out later to know who we are, and these are called categories. Therefore, the self is the product of the mind. Okay? Now let's go to the two kinds of self by Kant. So we have the empirical self and the transcendental self. For the empirical self, it pertains to particular aspects of the self that make the self unique, such as our physical aspect, our beauty to one another. Maganda siya, mas maganda ako, mas maganda yun. Our memories, our childhood memories, is uniquely formed because we grow up differently from one another. Our personalities that sometimes depends on our environment, our history, and also our culture will falls down into our empirical self. How about this transcendental self? What is this? It is the self as an activity or organizing principle that actively interprets, constructs, and gives meaning to collections of sensory data. Therefore, if yung empirical self are the collective memories, collective personalities, history, and culture that we know, our transcendental self will be the interpreter of those collective memories. Since the mind is the source of ideas and sensory impressions are just elements in producing the ideas. Okay, so the two self goes hand in hand. So what is this transcendental unity of a perception? The self is also outside of the body and goes beyond the limit of what we are experiencing. How is this? We go out with our comfort zone. If this is our comfort zone, what we are doing right now or where we are right now, this is our self. Sometimes we go beyond there so that we can experience something new. So that we can also experience feelings like feelings of excitement and surprise. So indeed, Ideas, which are bundles of impressions, according to Hume, is not being disregarded by Kant. So he also believed with the collective ideas that will eventually turn out to be your identification of the self. But even if ideas are temporary, there is still what we call space and time that will remain and will be part of oneself. So what is this space and time? So this is what we call, yes, we know. We know who we are. We can identify ourselves through these collective ideas, through our senses and experience. But sometimes we don't know what is beyond that. What is the will of the universe, or what is the will of the destiny? So that is what we call the space and the time. Our next philosopher is the founding father of psychoanalytic psychology and the psychodynamic theory, which uncover the hidden nature of the self through their personality or through the actions of the self. He is no other than Sigmund Freud. So he regarded the self as the I that ordinarily constitute both the mental and physical actions. So for the other philosophers, it's about sense perceptions, sense experiences, mental thinking, and the other principles. But for Sigmund Freud, yes, considerably andun pa rin yung word na mental concepts, thinking, the rationalization. But he added the physical action. So what you think is what you do. Parang ganon. Also, the I is a product of multiple interactions, systems, and schemes as it undergoes the process of continual change. The self undergoes continual stages, phases in life because we are having multiple interactions daily. We have the systems, the rules and regulations to follow, the rules and regulations of the universe. And we have the schemes, the set of organized and ordered thought of behavior. How about this topographical model of the I? So it says here that the I or the self has two parts. We have the conscious self and the unconscious self. So based on the picture, we have the unconscious self, which is at the bottom part of the ocean. So let's see as the self as the iceberg. And then the conscious part is the tip of the iceberg. So let's talk about first the conscious self. This is governed by reality principle, yung ngayon, yung nakikita mo ngayon, where behavior or experience are organized in a rational and practical way and suitable to the social environment. So that is your conscious self. Yun yung pinapakita mo sa society. Kasi yun yung kailangang ipakita sa society, and that's the reality of it. While the unconscious self is ruled by the pleasure principle and operates at pre-logical and pre-rational level. So when we say pleasure principle, dito papasok yung mga gusto natin, our deepest and deeper desires about life. Yung gustong gusto natin gawin sa reality, pero someone is stopping us because that is the principal law of the universe. It contains a mode of operations that comes before mental functions. So later on, we will discuss what are those operations nga ba. So all human functioning is based on this mode of operation. So basically, yung ayaw mong ilabas or i-portray is your unconscious self because the reality or the society is stopping you from doing it. But sometimes, this unconscious self is little by little lumalabas. What we want, minsan kapag hindi na natin kaya, umaangat yan. Like an iceberg, di ba? Minsan, nagle-lessen yung water, kaya tumataas yung tip, the conscious self, tumataas yung tip ng iceberg. Minsan naman, yung gusto nating gawin, lumulubog, our conscious self, is pumupunta sa unconscious self. O yung ayaw nating mangyari is nilalagay natin sa likod ng utak natin, which is the unconscious self.
Okay, the next concepts about identifying the self under Sigmund Freud are the id, ego, super ego, which are the structural model of the self. As you can see in the diagram, under unconscious part we have there id, ego, and the superego, but some of the underlying factors of the superego and ego are present in the conscious mind. So let's find out why. So the id is considered to be the instinctive dimension of the self. So the id is the one who initiates our pleasure principle, our hunger, our taste, our desire to be in the moment, to get what we want. While the superego is the action in terms of moral values and systems in the society. So superego follows the rules and regulations, while the ego is the rational, conscious aspect that controls the reasoning abilities of the self. So it operates according to the reality. That's why the superego and the ego landed on the conscious part because that is their role. While the ego is in the deeper part, which is in the unconscious, because that is what you desire. Now, let's see some examples. So here, so in picture number one, we have unconscious levels, no, identifying conscious and unconscious levels. So we have violent motives, fears, selfish needs, immoral urges. So these are the ones that we cannot face on. That's why we dampen these emotions to our unconscious. While on the conscious level, this is the reality. Going back to the structural model, we have the id, ego, and superego. Here is an example. So the id is saying that I need to eat right now because I'm really hungry. But the superego is saying that no, you cannot eat now because you're in the middle of a class. So the ego will now try to meditate which is which. Okay? Another is that the id is saying, I want it now. But the superego is saying, no, you cannot have it right now. You have to wait for the moment. And then the ego will try to meditate. So I need to do a bit of planning before we try to get a solution about it. Okay, so that's the process of id, ego, and superego. Here is the best example. So ito yung white sand sa Manila Bay. Okay? So we have there yung superego. So yun yung reality. Yun yung moral rules and regulations of reality kaya sobrang linis ng sand. While the ego part, which is the realistic moment or the realistic part of the world, is on the middle part of the white sand in Manila Bay. And the id, which is the true color of the Manila Bay is the dark part. So you can see there the relationship of the id, ego, and superego in terms of the Manila Bay. Our next philosopher is Gilbert Ryle. So he was best known for his criticism of what he called the official doctrine of Cartesian dualism as a theory of mind. So they have the same doctrine as Rene Descartes, but they differ to one another, as he claimed that Descartes Descartes' body and mind dualism create a category mistake. So let's find out what is that category mistake. So the concept of the mind, according to Ryle, is that thinking is the I, since it is just a ghost in the machine, and the mind is never separate from the body. So there is no separation, unlike Descartes na they are separate from one another, the mind and the body. But for Ryle, it's the same as one. There's no separation. The self then must be a pattern of behavior or the tendency of an individual to behave in a certain way in a particular situation. Therefore, that the self is the action towards a pattern of our behavior. So that is what Ryle postulated the identification of the self. So kung kay Descartes we have I think, therefore I am. Kay Ryle, it is I act, therefore I am. And you are what you do. So if you are always eating, you are that person. If you are always talking, you are that person. If you are shy, you are that person. Okay? So the perceptions, thoughts, emotions, remembering, and willing of the self can be understood by observable behavior. So the self can be observed through our actions. Next philosopher is we have the famous couple. We have Paul and Patricia Churchland. So for them, the body mind can't be solved by the philosophers, but the neuroscientists. So both of them are neuroscientists, and we can say that they depend on how the mind works through the different processes of neurons and the functions of the brain. So what is this eliminative materialism? So there is no mind, but there is a brain. The self is the brain itself because that is how we rationalize, that is how we behave, and that is how we act. So how could it be possible that the self is the same as the brain? How can you perceive yourself and the choice you make? So it is through the brain. That's why it is the self. They assume that even morality and free will are products of the mind, which is yes, right? If your brain is not functioning anymore, you are dead. And then your brain also says or is also saying to you what is right and wrong. So the brain is instrumental in making us human and special. So just like what I've said in our earlier discussions, that it is our innate ability to rationalize because we have a brain. Unlike animals, they have their brain but they don't rationalize in terms of their own thought. Okay, so what is this? It is where activities happen with an individual is explained through understanding the existing condition of the brain and how it works. So how do we know the process of the brain? So it may undergo MRI or magnetic resonance imaging or CT scan. So that is how we analyze, and that is how neuroscientists works on the properties of the brain. Our last philosopher is Maurice Merleau-Ponty. So he's a philosopher and man of letters, the leading exponent of phenomenology in France. So he notes that everything that people are aware of it contained with the consciousness. Very true. If you are aware of that reality, then it is contained under your consciousness. So what is consciousness? It is a dynamic form responsible for actively structuring conscious ideas and physical behavior. So you have the right what to think, you have the right to act because it's according to your conscience. So the body is merely an object or possession being possessed by the self. So parang ginawa niyang
the body is a material being and the self is our soul. So the self is an embodied subjectivity. It cannot be body object because of the oneness between the self and the body. So it's like the self is the main, siya yung naggagalaw ng puppet. Parang yung puppeteer is the self and the puppet itself is the body. So we have here self-body relationship. So the body plays a vital role in perception, knowledge, and meaning. Okay? Because it is what we have in the real life situation. Ito yung panlabas. The body is our general knowledge for knowing the world and giving meaning to it, like our senses. The body subject is the giver of meaning that we experience in life. Okay, what is this phenomenology of perception? It says here that the body and mind are intertwined. So it is basically as one whole or one concept. So we cannot separate the body and the mind. So kahit sabihin natin ibang function ng body, ibang function ng mind, it is considered as one. So the philosophy of Ponty is based on Wolfgang Kohler and Kurt Kafka's Gestalt psychology. So when we say Gestalt psychology, the sum is greater than its parts. So a whole is greater than its parts. So just like a pizza, mas magandang tignan kapag buo kaysa bawas na. Right? Kaya sometimes, di ba, yung panloloko na pag inalok ka ng pagkain, ay bawas na, ayoko na. So, as a person, minsan, ganun din tayo. We see or we look at the picture as a whole rather than its parts. Okay, for the summation of diverse view of the self, we have here. So we have for the philosophers Socrates, Plato, and St. Augustine, it is an immortal soul that exists over time. Descartes, self-thinking. John Locke, by self-conscience. David Hume, changing perceptions. Immanuel Kant, unifying subject. Sigmund Freud, it is multi-layered. Gilbert Ryle, it is the way people behave or the actions. We have the churchlands. The self is the brain, and Ponty is embodied subjectivity. Okay, thank you so much. This sum up for our chapter 1, philosophy.